Did Jesus really exist? It's a common claim by Christians, yet when you really examine the evidence critically, it's an entirely empty claim. We simply have no reason to think that this Jesus guy, as described in the Bible, was ever real. Yet the religious have to insist that he was because, feelings. Yeah, it's every bit as dumb as it sounds. So here's a YouTube channel by Jerrel Connor, and he wants to give us evidence that Jesus existed. Except he can't, because there simply is no evidence that stands up to any kind of critical scrutiny. I think it's clear that he's done absolutely no research on his own. He's just reading off of an apologetics website and chugging the Kool-Aid. But what else do the religious do? I very rarely ever see one who has done any kind of intellectual, scholarly research, and those people, they don't tend to stay religious for very long. So let's see what Jerrel has to say.
Jesus. Was he a real person that actually existed? Not was he the Son of God, or did he rise from the dead? Just did he actually exist?
See, that's really the problem for the religious. Even if we could establish that Jesus was a real person, they still have every bit of work to do in order to get to the things that they actually believe about Jesus. Because Jesus as a person doesn't really get them anywhere. They don't believe that Jesus was a person. They believe that Jesus was a magical man-god. Their entire theology is based on that belief. It requires it. So if you're not going to prove that, and I have no idea how you'd even go about it, then none of this actually matters.
Here are the facts. Jesus of Nazareth is most documented figure throughout all antiquity.
No, not really. There are stories told about him in a book of mythology. We do not have a single demonstrable eyewitness account of Jesus, period. Since every single one of the Gospels was written anonymously, we can't verify that the people who actually wrote these books ever knew Jesus personally. We know Paul never did. He just had a drug trip on the road. Absolutely none of the stories told about Jesus outside of the Bible come from people who lived when Jesus was supposedly alive. This is just a bald assertion that doesn't stand up to a moment's critical scrutiny.
More than Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Plato.
Yeah, but you know who has had more stories told about them? Other gods. There are tons of stories told about Zeus and Shiva and all the rest, far more than were ever told about Jesus. And like I said, unless this leads to corroboratory evidence that Jesus, the man-god that Christians believe in being real, it doesn't really mean anything. It's like saying L. Ron Hubbard existed, therefore Xenu is real. It doesn't work that way.
Yet no one seems to question the existence of those men.
Actually, there are plenty who do. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter if they ever existed. I don't care if Plato was real. I don't care if he just made up Socrates. It doesn't matter one bit. We have their writings, something we simply don't have from Jesus, and if it turns out that they were all just fanciful inventions, who cares? It doesn't matter. I have no reason to care about them one bit. But Christians can't say that. If Jesus wasn't real, if Jesus wasn't the magical man-god that they believe he was, then all of Christianity falls apart. You can't say that it doesn't matter. Because it does.
Though the Bible is a major source, it's not the only source.
Yeah, it is, if you're talking about eyewitness testimony. Otherwise, it's all just hearsay. People repeating stories that they've been told by others who may or may not have been actual eyewitnesses. There are no primary sources available for the historicity of Jesus. None at all.
A few of non-Christian and non-friendly accounts from ancient historians and philosophers who wrote about Jesus include Thales.
The problem is, we have no copies of Thales's work. The only way we know about it is from Christian apologetic sources dating to the late 2nd century. We have plenty of cases where Christians have simply invented unjustified details about Thales because it serves their purposes. The earliest mention of Thales that we have was in Eusebius, who was supposedly quoting Julius Africanus. So we're already looking at best, a third-hand account, if it wasn't simply invented altogether. Now, keep in mind that most of what is mentioned about Thales takes place hundreds of years before the supposed birth of Jesus, and he only supposedly mentions the darkness at the death of Christ, a common mythic element which is mentioned by no other contemporary historian. Seneca, Pliny, Josephus, among many others, would have said something about it if it had ever happened, which, of course, they didn't. So we can assume that this is just another invention by Eusebius, who was known to have a tenuous relationship with the truth anyhow.
Cornelius Tacitus.
Except we know that's not true. Tacitus lived long after the supposed life of Jesus, and therefore he's not a direct eyewitness. All Tacitus wrote was that there were Christians, a fact that no one denies, and that their movement was started by someone named Chrestus, who was put to death by the Romans. It is likely that Tacitus was simply repeating stories that he heard from early Christians. The fact that he gets the details wrong is very telling. He calls Pilate a procurator, which is not his proper title. Pilate was a prefect. That tells us that Tacitus wasn't knowledgeable about the facts in this case. He was relating a story. Regardless, it doesn't tell us a thing about the real existence of Jesus.
Bar Seropian.
Mara bar Seropian, or Mara the son of Seropian, was a Roman Stoic philosopher who wrote about the death of Jesus sometime after 73 CE in a letter to his son. We do not have the original letter. It is only preserved in a Christian manuscript dating to the 6th or 7th century. Again, we don't know if this is accurate, and the way it's written, it is certainly not written by a direct eyewitness. It is likely a retelling of an account that he received second or third hand, and thus, it's not evidence of anything.
Flemm.
Flemm was a non-Christian source that lived between 80 and 140 CE, so again, not an eyewitness. He claimed that Jesus could see the future. And that sounds like he's trying to describe Jesus as a soothsayer or a mystic, and that's certainly not the image of Jesus that Christians want to push. Obviously, since he didn't see any of it for himself and must have been operating on second or third-hand information, this must be discarded as ridiculous.
Pliny the Younger.
Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor of what is now Turkey, wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan in 112 CE asking for advice on what he should do about Christian troublemakers. He does not mention Jesus at all, and the existence of Christians is not in question. So again, this is a pointless source. He didn't live at a time when he could have had any eyewitness information about Jesus. Thus, why are we talking about him?
And Josephus.
Josephus wasn't born until 37 CE, meaning he was after the supposed time of Jesus. Again, not an eyewitness. He supposedly wrote in his Antiquities of the Jews around 93 CE a passage that is widely accepted as an early Christian forgery. A Jewish Pharisee would never have written that passage, and Josephus never became a Christian. Further, it is written in a style that doesn't match what came before or after in the original text. If you remove it entirely, the passage makes sense. Prior to that passage, he'd been talking about the things that Pilate had done to the Jews in general, and immediately following, the next line is, about the same time, also another sad calamity put the Jews into disorder. This passage doesn't fit at all. It was just shoehorned in there by early Christians. This passage is never made mention of until Eusebius, good old dishonest Eusebius, which again makes no sense. Early Christian apologists like Clement of Alexandria would have talked about this up one side and down the other if it had existed at that time. It proves nothing other than Christians are dishonest.
I've not heard of any serious modern-day historians making any arguments against Jesus' actual existence.
Then you're not paying any attention, because there are tons of modern-day historians who doubt Jesus ever existed at all. But as I said, it depends on which Jesus you're talking about. Some guy who lived in Palestine at the time and upon whom the mantle of godhood was posthumously draped, or a real magical man-god that Christians believe in. If you don't have the latter, then you're wasting everyone's time, and you won't find very many historians who will agree on the latter. It's all just bait and switch. We'll talk about the possibility of a real person, then pretend that proves the man-god. No, that's not how any of this works.
What we must not do is deny where the evidence leads because of their potential implications.
But you have to be honest about the evidence, and you're not. You don't understand the evidence. You probably just copied this off of an apologetics website somewhere because it makes you feel good to think that Jesus is real, and you never did any kind of research at all on just what these sources actually say. Because it doesn't matter to you what these sources actually say. This isn't about following the evidence where it leads. This is about taking your pre-existing beliefs and rationalizing any shred of evidence that you can find to support it, while ignoring all of the things that would make the entire endeavor pointless. This is typical for the religious. Surface scans for emotional comfort because you can't find anything else convincing.
How about you guys? Have you had someone tell you Jesus was not real?
They're right, because there simply is no evidence for the magical man-god version of Jesus. It's an absurd claim. Absolutely no one ought to believe it. That isn't where the evidence leads. But this isn't about evidence, it's about rationalization. But the religious don't like that, so they give you half the story and pretend that that's all they need to do. It's why they spend so much time crafting half-truths and emotionally comforting narratives to appeal to those who already believe, but don't do a thing for those who are skeptical. That's why they don't want to talk to atheists, because we're just going to point out how terrible all of these ideas actually are. And they are terrible. They don't stand up to any critical scrutiny at all. You have to be already deluded or lacking any critical thinking skills whatsoever in order to take any of this seriously. The religious know they can't compete with people who only care about the evidence. That's why they hide. And that's why we laugh.
Bum